It's a real treat. I'm really excited to have Minna and Bayo back here. I know you all are as well. And I'm really happy to finally meet Charlotte Fox Weber, who I've admired from afar ever since she joined us at the Great Wave.
Yes, very glad to be here.
Just by way of introduction, since it's Charlotte's first time up here, Charlotte founded the psychotherapy practice at the School of Life in London. Last year, she and co-founded, with some other psychotherapists, Examined Life, which is a startup that hopes to loosen up, maybe that's the word, the practice of psychotherapy. And she has a book coming out next year called What We Want. So thank you for joining us, Charlotte.
Very glad to be here.
I'm going to start with something you've written in your introduction, which is a question. Do we have desires, or do desires have us?
So I think that we have a range of desires at every stage and age of life, and it's up to us to make sense of them, identify them, and constantly prioritize and reprioritize what matters. And we're given mixed messages about the acceptability of desire. So it starts with manners. If you think of a child saying, "I want a glass of milk," it's ruder than saying, "I would like a glass of milk," or "Could I please have a glass of milk?" And I think it goes from there, that we are supposed to conceal certain longings and temper ourselves, hold back. And sometimes we're meant to perform other wants and pretend. So you can think of times that you have pretended to want something you really didn't want. You eat food that is ghastly and you say nothing. You go along with a work situation that makes
you want a candy bar and someone says, "Here's a banana," right? Yeah.
Right. Or you find yourself people-pleasing in all sorts of insidious ways. So you get into a weird, overwhelming situation and feel pressured and pushed and pulled in different directions. And very often, you haven't really clarified what it is you actually want. And the people-pleasing thing can be a real roadblock, a real obstacle for us.
So it sounds to me, the subtext here is that it starts very early on. Like, people are our parents, but others as well are heavily invested in steering us towards wanting some things and not others, or expressing our wants in particular ways. And it seems to me that's very, if we're going to talk about equity, that's strange, because regardless of what the socioeconomic circumstances of our upbringing, we can be disadvantaged in terms of knowing what it is we want, depending on those very early childhood
Absolutely. And whatever culture we're in, I think we're given mixed messages about desire. I think with Adam and Eve, the conflict is right there, where it's the story of our existence, but also the story of everything that goes wrong for us and the ways we get into trouble. So we're conflicted about desire itself. And I don't think there are any cultures that have it entirely resolved. Some are, of course, different than others. But I think that it's a dilemma that we live with. And it's a healthy dilemma, so it's not that we need to entirely resolve it.
So I imagine being a psychotherapist is like there's a voyeuristic element of it, right? How do hidden desires play out when someone comes to you in therapy?
So very often, I think that we're not overt about our desires, and I think that psychotherapists are probably to blame for that. Historically, I don't think it's a question that gets asked enough. I have had so many years of mediocre therapy myself that I know what it is to sit there waiting to be asked what I wanted. And finally, I asked the question myself. What were you going to say?
Mediocre therapy? Like, what's mediocre therapy?
I mean, I hope I wasn't the mediocre therapist, but being in therapy that wasn't as effective as it could be. So actually, I began to want to write this book out of my own impatience, because I had therapy that just wasn't as helpful, as life-enhancing as I felt it could be. And I think that desire often gives a kind of energy and agency and direction of travel for the work. But In therapy, very often people will talk about difficulties and obstacles and problems and crises, and those things, of course, matter, but underneath it is some kind of longing. And when you uncover that longing, it's incredibly liberating to see what happens.
Do people experience that uncovering? I imagine it's a process to get there, but is it a relief to them, or I imagine there's some sadness to it as well, right?
It can be a relief, it can be a surprise. It's usually more disturbing to run away from some kind of hidden longing. So something that I see again and again is that we push away certain wants that might feel unacceptable or impossible, out of reach. And we put them into a kind of emotional storage facility. And the storage facility is our unlived life. And very often, people fantasize about their unlived life, and it might not be fully conscious, but you find yourself frustrated in a situation, and you just imagine, if only this had happened, I would be living this glorious existence. Or one day, I will do the thing I really care about, and then I will be self-actualized. And we're often kind of dipping into this storage facility of our unlived life, but not applying it to our actual life.
Yeah.
So one of the tasks of therapy, I think, is to really make use of those fantasies and encourage people to look at what's possible and to look at what's impossible, because that happens all the time also.
Yeah. I'm reminded of, did you see Jonathan Rosen's talk yesterday, where he talked about his desire to be a rock star and how he saw that in himself and transformed it into art. And it seemed to me the most healthy thing to do. But some desires are, like, some things that we want are impossible, right? Are inappropriate. I mean, people have desires that they should really, like, keep a lid on.
Well,
right?
I think the desire can always find a new home. I think it's just about the specifics. I think that we sometimes get very attached to the granular details of a certain story going a certain way. And actually, it's called masturbating, when you start thinking that things must go a certain way.
Masturbating?
When people are masturbating, it's a problem.
That's one for the highlight reel. Masturbating.
And very often that happens with relationships. Love must be this way, and then you feel ripped off because it hasn't worked out the way it must. So sort of letting go of that and finding a more flexible approach that go with the twists and turns of life can be expansive. But also, it's incredible how many illusions we have. So I work with people who are incredibly bright and aware, and yet part of them believes that they will have endless lives to kind of try things out, to be married several times, to have different careers. Accepting mortality is definitely one of those things that can clash with certain fantasies and certain desires, because we think that we will have some kind of forever on some level, even if we know that obviously we will die.
Yeah. Minna, this seems like a good place to pivot, because the sensuous knowledge, as I understand it, and please correct me if I have it a bit off, is about many things, but one of them is an acceptance and an embrace of what is really happening at all levels. It's embodied, it's sensuous, it's sort of free of delusions and being too in our own head in a way that saps us of energy. And one thing I really liked about your talk on Friday is when you talked about curiosity about who baked the bread that we had for breakfast. And that seems to me about that wanting to know, or that curiosity, seems to me part of what Charlotte is talking about in terms of coming to terms with our lives and how our lives impact others. So,
yeah, curiosity and desire connected. Although I do want to say that the question I raised about being aware of who bakes your bread was more of a thought experiment than something to take literally. I mean, of course, why not if you can find out? But we live in a time in which there's already, I think, the sentiment of our times. It kind of inspires a lot of moral panic in people, and whether they are thinking conscientiously about everything and if they're being virtuous and doing the right thing about X, Y, Z. So I don't mean to add to that and say constantly masturbate about who baked your bread. But yeah, the point is really to awaken curiosity, because curiosity leads to awareness. And so if we can think about the breakfast that we have, something that is so mundane, with a sense of curiosity and presence and awareness as a thought experiment, not every single morning, then we can eventually apply that to things that are bigger, to thinking about democracy or equality, or thinking about the relationships between women and men, gender equality, and to think not only with the prism of what I call Euro-patriarchal knowledge, which might be to think of the statistics of, what is inequality between the genders, what does that look like, but to think about the feeling of it. What does it feel like to be a woman living in a male-dominant society? How does that affect our desires? And, we typically think of desire as connected to sexuality. I think for most people, when you hear the word desire, you think sexuality. And that, of course, has largely to do because sexual desire is so physically evident. So, when you feel sexually aroused, blood rushes to the erogenous zones, your heart beats faster, you flush, all of those things. But I think when we bring that sense of curiosity and awareness to desire, it's also interesting, or I anyway am interested in how desire also manifests in other parts of our lives. So a kind of existential desire, and how that also manifests physically. So, going back to women living in a male-dominant society, I think we can see how that manifests in the way that women walk or take space, how we age, how we interact with others, and all of that has to do with desire as well.
How are existential, tell us, I want to stay there for a minute, how our existential desires manifest physically. Can you give us some more examples? Like, how have you, if you make that real in an everyday sense, like how would that be true for you, if you're willing to share?
I mean, one thing that comes to mind when you ask that question is how, and related to what Charlotte was saying, that already from such a young age, already with children, we're teaching the future generations what to desire and what not to desire. And when you think about toys, for instance, the kinds of toys that girls are given to play with are typically to do with household chores or caregiving activities, passive roles, really. And so what that is doing is kind of teaching girls patriarchal desires, teaching girls to desire things that uphold a patriarchal society. And that, of course, manifests in body language and in the ways that girls play. Like, you can see the differences in the bodies of little girls and little boys.
And how people take up space, even into adulthood.
Absolutely, yeah.
I feel like one of the strong messages for women still is to be wanted more than to want. So the people-pleasing can really get in the way of having space for other desires.
Yeah, I mean, that's part of the play industry, and of course, all of the advertising and sexual objectification of women that we see around us. It's constantly being fed the notion that you should be wanted. And yes, absolutely, like, not, instead of pursuing our own desires and having agency to make them manifest.
And as you say, desire is often sexualized, and people think it is just erotic, but it's very existential and And feeling that you should be desirable more than just desiring, it can play out professionally in incredible ways, where you're serving someone, you're helping someone find you appealing rather than actually making space for your own longings.
Yeah.
Bayo, I have a feeling that you're going to say that we should start thinking about this in a whole other way. that I've chosen the wrong starting point. Oh,
We can't.
Oh, we can't hear you.
I'm kidding.
No fair.
Shake things up. Can you hear me? Okay. I'm deeply attracted to the idea of desire as structural, right? As more than the human, as liminal. It flows. Minna was saying something a while ago about the Oedipal conflicts, that supports capitalist arrangements, basically. It's mommy, me, and daddy, that triangle of desire that captures us in particular ways of relating to the world. So that tells me that desire is, in a sense, we can have desires from a humanist perspective. We have desires. But from a different perspective, desires have us, right? Desires are territorial. What we want already implicates and brings in the more than human, right? So what does it mean to be in that chair right now and to be a desirous being, right? What does it mean to be in this furniture, in this space? What does it mean to wear that color right now? It means we're hybridized beings. We're always hyphenated. We're always experimenting in molecular ways that even our cognition is not always aware of. Our bodies are, sometimes I like to say that desire is the impossibility of design, right? Design is how we program things. Desire is the errancy, the spilling away from linearity, from control, from the usual humanist ways we speak about intention. Oh, I want to do this, but the world is so filled and profuse and emergent that it spills away from those gutters of intention. What else did you want me to say?
What do I want you to say? It's a good question. Masturbating.
I love that word. Can I? Did you?
I don't think I invented that, no.
Okay.
But I use it all the time. It's a good one.
I'm going to steal it.
Well, I personally have tried to
We can all
stop-
masturbate. Yeah.
I have tried to stop saying should.
Should, yeah.
Should.
Yeah.
Because I've developed a real allergy to like, oh, you should do that or you should do that.
Right.
Even for myself, too.
Right.
I don't think it's healthy.
We are always, there is a way we think about morality that invokes the language of should and ought to and stuff like that. And there's ethics. Ethics is not morality. Ethics is how bodies come to be, how we speak and what gets left out of things in their materializations. But morality is the should and ought to, and we will often need that. For instance, indigenous societies and communities will often need a should, in boundary making, in saying, this cannot happen, and you cannot come here. Stay there, right? We will often need that. It's the trouble comes in risking or noticing that in creating moral boundaries that way, we also risk getting incarcerated in our own constructions, right? So even should and ought to can trap us, right? So yes, use it, but notice its costs, right? That's what I'll say to that.
It seems to me that maybe there's two different types of shoulds. So there's the should, which is society, authority, all of the norms of how we should behave appropriately and this and that or the other. And then there's the should that is internal, our own personal should, which has to do with honesty. I should do the thing that feels true to me. I should follow my own values. I should try to live up to a certain community ideal if it's one that I strongly believe in. And absolutely also when it comes to like an indigenous prism of we should be able to sort of decolonize our minds and
Right.
and live authentically to our respective cultures around the world. So that it just seems like should is, it's not necessarily negative.
No,
You
no.
know, it can be both.
No, I mean the Yoruba people have the ori, right? You know, the
Yeah, I
ori,
spoke about that.
the idea that we are connected with powers, and a good person is a person of character and good morality and good standing in the society, and there's a should about that.
What's the word you said?
Ori, that's another word for you.
Okay.
Ori, right there with masturbate.
On Friday, I spoke about Ogbon and Ogbon Ori and
Yes.
Ogbon Inu
Oh, you-
being two different things. Yeah, I don't speak Yoruba fluently, but
Me
I know
too.
those words.
I want to get back to unfulfilled longings, and I'm wondering, I don't think, we don't have good language for it in English. But, you know, unrequited love, it's a very sentimental thing, and I think we have a lot of respect, I think, culturally for unrequited love. But if there are more existential longings that go unfulfilled, certainly in the American context, I think it's seen as pathetic. Like death of a
Yes.
salesman, oh, that person was a loser, and we should feel sorry for them. American tragedy is someone who doesn't live up to their potential or doesn't get a chance to fulfill their desires. And I just want to interrogate that a bit. I mean, is there a culture that's alive and thriving today that has a healthy, a better way of looking at unfulfilled longings?
I don't know, but tell me if you find out. I feel like it's a struggle that we grapple with, and I think regret is actually incredibly helpful as a concept, and it's become stigmatized. So in that way that you were just describing, people don't like to have regret, and have no regrets. You only live once, and yet I think regret is a very honest part of the human condition, and it's almost inevitable that you'll regret something. And I think owning regret is transformative because it's a form of wanting, even if it's something that wasn't possible. You regret something, and when it's honest and accurate regret, I think it's facing something authentically, and it takes courage to actually have regret.
To admit to it or to feel it, really?
To acknowledge it and consider what it means. So I was telling you about a woman I worked with. She was actually the first woman who came to me for psychotherapy, and she was dying of pancreatic cancer, and I had no experience. I was very nervous, and she was in her bed, and she started telling me about her regret, and she regretted not snuggling her two children more when they were little. And she said, "Don't try to talk me out of my regret." And of course I did, because it's unbearable when you're seeing someone at death's door, and I wanted to rescue her or make her life better in some way. And her sons, who were now grown up in their 30s, were on their way to visit her. And I pretty much said, "Tell them you love them and snuggle them now and make it okay." And she said, "You have to understand, I may do that, but I still am allowed to regret that I didn't spend more time snuggling them when they were little." And that was her truth. And she was courageous, so incredibly courageous, to acknowledge that, as excruciating as it was. But it was kind of liberating for her at the same time, because she knew she was courageous. And there was dignity in that.
Right. Right. No, that's beautiful. And it's, you know, in other cultures, you know, that may not require that much courage, right? Regret or failure of different kinds is actually supported because those cultures do not premise their worlds on a stable, static self, right? It's that we share. I remember doing my PhD research, and I told some guy to meet me someplace at a certain time, a Yoruba guy, so from our village. And he comes up 2 hours after we agreed, and he just rides his bike there. And I said, "What were you doing? The time. And he said, "This was the right time. This time that I came is the right time. What were you expecting?" Right? It was an entirely different notion of time and temporality that was playing up there. So in just the same way, I think cultures hold, and I think this is what you're speaking to as well, that cultures hold these notions of desire and longing differently. And we are presently at the risk of being totalizingly trapped in a certain global arrangement that may not allow for that kind of expression, that kind of creativity, that kind of, it would take vast amounts of courage to be able to break through to other forms of life and possibility. Yeah.
Completely.
I'm thinking that desire or longing is by nature unrequited.
Yes.
And there's, that core. That's why desire, in some sense, it's like a gateway to freedom almost, because it is by its nature not met. And yet at the same time, it is really important to understand that there are also very structural sort of obstacles to meeting desires depending on one's background and one's both individual and collective circumstances. But there's a real beauty in how, maybe perceiving that we cannot, we don't get what we want just like that. We have to sort of make efforts for it. And I'm thinking about how, at least for me, there's probably 3 kind of main desires, if I were to create a framework, that I have in life, and that's one is the desire for a kind of intimacy with loved ones, friends, family, a partner, and then there's the desire for social change, and that of course looks very different to people, and then the desire for knowledge, the thirst to understand things, to have clarity about things. And if you think about all of those 3 desires, at least when I do, they are constantly in process. So there's parts of them that are unmet, and that really is the driving force. That's like what gives you willpower as a human to keep going, because you have these desires, and there's a part of them that hasn't yet been fully satiated.
What about a renegade, fugitive desire? A desire that you cannot trace to yourself? Maybe that is ancestral. Does anyone here sometimes feel, I don't know where that desire comes from, or that longing comes, a hand is up there. No $1,000 for you today, though. Nothing like that today. But does it feel like something shows up? It's something like what Charles and I were discussing yesterday. Something shows up that shouldn't be there, right?
Shouldn't.
And well, in the ways that we think about the self and its monolithicness, something shows up that steals into the framework that we don't know how to trace. It's nothing like us. It's nothing like how our images of ourselves, but yet it's there, right?
Yeah.
Some theories about that is that it's ancestral, or it's cybernetic, or it's the way we interact with Facebook. How many of us here are very interested in seeing our posts on Facebook liked? Like, you derive a sense of joy and happiness when you see that someone has liked your comment on Facebook. Y'all are lying.
Nobody.
You're lying. Because it seems we're constantly, and this is the way we don't talk about the way technology uses us too. How the world, the material world, also is desiring as well, and how we're caught up in ecologies of desire, right? And so we're used by the things that supposedly we use, right? I'll stop there.
Yeah, no, it's interesting. You talk about Facebook. I mean, I would say, yes, I would want to see my post liked. Then, this was years ago, because I haven't been on Facebook in many years, when I was not getting enough likes, among other
not
reasons.
Facebook anymore,
I just, for my response to that was to stop. Was to stop engaging.
Stop
Like
engaging.
if I wasn't going to get what I wanted,
Yeah?
I'm going to stop trying to get what I want
It's-
through that means and try to want something else.
It's not that easy to disengage. I don't want
No,
to
it's not.
complexify it,
Yeah,
but
yeah.
but I remember a guy telling me that, Bayo, I'm going to get rid of Facebook. I want to get everyone into permaculture, so I'm going to get rid of Facebook, and I'm going to inspire the world to get away from Facebook. I said, how are you going to do this?
Permaculture? So like Facebook,
Was
but no
it-
permaculture. Like that's kind of like a candy bar banana. Like what is
Right, but he's a permaculture person, practitioner, and he was like, I need people to go outside, away from their laptops and screens.
Right.
So I'm going to get people away from doing that. And I said, tell me how you think of doing this. He said, I'm going to start a Facebook group and inspire people to go outside. So there are ways that the world comes back in, right?
And I mean, this will sound provocative, but you could also try to remove appealing women if you dangerously desire them, and we can see how that plays out. I think trying to remove the actual thing that you desire, it doesn't really address the root of the problem,
Right.
which is looking at what matters to you and what your priorities are, and what you said about how desire is a kind of forever longing. Even the word desire comes from the stars, and we don't get there. We reach for the stars, but we don't actually consume the stars, but you don't stop looking at them. So I think when you can live with the idea that you don't need to be instantly fulfilled, you can seek it without demanding it at every moment. I think that can be helpful.
And how do you help? Do you see it as your job as helping people do that?
I ask difficult questions and make space for deliberately concentrating on these issues, because I think we are distracted and we know we're distracted and cluttered and given mixed messages, and actually just having clarity, having space for curiosity, as you say, curiosity awakens something. And the lack of desire is a terrible problem. So when people come to therapy feeling no desire, it's often depression, it's death on some level. And it was Tolstoy who said, boredom is the desire for desires. So I think we also want to want something. So it's just making space for deliberate concentration and looking at the conflicts, looking at the different voices of authority that have gotten in our way, that get us stuck.
You said it takes time, though, and I'm thinking about Fanta Troy's talk last night at Agency, and one of her observations was just so simple, but really, really moved me. Was that, when she imagines a better future, is one in which Black women, just speaking in the United States context more specifically, but it's broader, aren't working 2 jobs. They could have, equity would be for a Black woman to have 1 job, not 2 or 3, as many of them do in my country. So if you don't have the time, as we understand it, the leisure, does it take a leisure time to do this? I mean, or can you do what people need to do, should do, to get to that, like on the bus?
I think it's making a point of intentionally asking yourself those questions and then living the questions. One of the things that woman on her deathbed said to me was, it wouldn't have taken long at all if I had just stopped and considered that snuggling my children mattered, but I was always worrying about the next thing and the next thing. And she just hadn't asked the question. And again, I think it's the question itself. Freud did ask the question, what do women want? I don't know if you've looked into that question in particular.
Yeah, I think about it all the time. What do women want? I mean, I think that's what the feminist movement is about, right? Like it's being a woman is in a patriarchal world is, you could say, is living a life of unmet desires. And again, because we tend to think of desire as functioning in the sexual realm, we kind of miss the point of unmet desires when you're a woman is also the desire to see leaders who look like you, the desire for workspaces that aid your sense of being.
Life longings.
Desires to not see your people who are like you objectified around you. You know, all of those kinds of existential desires, absolutely. I think that's what, and I think that one thing that women really want above all is safety, a sense of safety, to exist in the world without feeling constant fear. And that's something that's very difficult.
Have you ever watched a movie where at the end of the movie you find out that the hero won at the end of the day? The protagonist was victorious, but the victory was part of the plan all along of the villain, right? That you've read the hero's journey, right? You've read about the hero's journey. Arriving is supposedly pure and transcendent. But to arrive, I've been telling the story of the monster's journey and how the monster infiltrates the hero, right? Who's watched Batman here? You guys know what I'm talking about. The Dark Knight, right? When the hero lives long enough to become the villain. My point here is, when my sister was speaking yesterday about equality, I need that in my life, right? I'm right there. I need the equality. I need good white allies. I need people to stand for me while I pay my bills, while I live and exist in this moral order. But I cannot stop there, is what I'm saying. I cannot, because sometimes what we want is what the system engineers us to want, right? And we are programmed in molecular ways to want what the system can accommodate. That is why we are pressing, and my work straddles the line between psychology and politics, right? Because psychology and psychotherapy has done so much for us, and like James Hillman said, for 100 years, nothing has changed because of psychotherapy. Right, I'm sorry, but we're in the same, shrinks all of us, right? And yet, psychology seems oblivious to larger structures. It performs the self as a unit of capitalism. And so what we do as practitioners is to put people back to work. Come here, fix you, get back to work.
Without looking at the system that is created.
Exactly, without looking at the world we're sending people back into. That's why my tradition would think of insanity as a breakthrough, right? Like a breakthrough into other ways of being and seeing the world. That insanity is not as pathological as we think it is. So I don't want to centralize black women on the Titanic, right? I don't want to centralize black bodies on a world that is dying. I want to follow desire into errant places, other places of power beyond the familiar. That's all I'm going to say.
Yeah. Thank you.
Yeah.
In the time remaining, I want to maybe get a little closer to that and think about everyone assembled here as we go back home in our lives. Maybe not think. Let's say we can do our own inner work on our own time. But is there something that we can do in our daily going about town, in our work, in our sending emails, that can create safety, maybe more time for others, the people that we encounter, to get closer to what it is that they want?
One thing that really matters is honesty. We can all be a little bit more honest about our true desires. The poet Muriel Rukeyser says something that I absolutely love. She said, when a woman speaks the truth about her life, the world cracks open. There's still so much dishonesty, not only for women, for everybody, and what is it we actually want? And I think what we can do when it comes to the social sort of constructs that shape our lives So what Bayo is speaking about, like these norms and seeking errant glitches where desire can exist, is to realize that we have three choices. We can either accept the status quo, we can agree with it, or we can oppose it. And I certainly find myself opposing a lot of things, especially those that repress desires. So we can all be a bit more honest and a bit more in opposition to repressed desires.
Charlotte?
I like the idea of honesty. I think that sometimes means being honest about the ways we mask ourselves and
Right.
hide and
Right.
put on a show.
Right.
Candor can even be its own mask. So
Right.
we're obsessed with authenticity and vulnerability, and psychotherapists talk about it all the time. It's really hard, actually, to show vulnerability and truly be authentic. So I think it can be honest when someone says, I was really faking it. And we fake it all the time. So watch out for the ways that you might be faking it to yourself, talking yourself out of wanting something because it might be unsightly, it might be at odds with your values. I think tolerating the kind of taboo desires is really important too, not censoring yourself.
Beautiful. Beautiful.
And I mean, also, because women are typically conditioned to be more vulnerable. So just, I'm curious what you think about the notion that to be honest is to be more vulnerable. Maybe for women to be honest, or for people who are conditioned to always be speaking, about race or gender or our oppressions of various sorts, maybe being honest is to actually just speak about whatever, more mundane things, more, or to be stronger can also be a way of being more honest.
There's a fungal pathogen called, I forget its name, but in Mexico, it's become a delicacy. It's called huitlacoche. It's a meal. I'm interested in the point where this disease, a plant disease, becomes a dish, right? That inflection point where a disease becomes a meal, a reason for celebration. I think failure has been demonized, pathologized, displaced, especially in a world where everything ought to be correct. We miss out on the generativity or the generative incapacitation that comes with failure. Not failure as inadequacy, but failure as a site of excess. I think what we can do today is to mount up a politics that is not about recognition or being visible or speaking truth to power, but it's about a politics where we share our failures, like huitlacoche. Where
what?
Huitlacoche.
Oh, okay.
I'm probably not pronouncing it right, but
Mark? Yeah? Good. Okay. Mark is from Mexico.
right? Okay, so I get it. So we need ways of a seditious politics where we share failure. There's a university in India called Swaraj University. It's not about grades. Failure is celebrated. There are no disciplines. There are no teachers. There are no professors. It's about inquiry. And people called kojis, right? They sit in circles and they share jealousy. They sit in circles and they share jealousy as a gift, as a resource, right? What if confusion is a resource instead of trying to get ahead of the curve all the time? So we need these places, these cracks in modernity, where we can mount up an insurgent politics of failing together. Yeah.
Beautiful. Charlotte, Minna, Bayo, I think let's end there.
Okay.
Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Real